Hello and welcome to Fiction Fans, a podcast where we read books and other words too. I'm Lily.
And I'm Sarah, and we are so delighted that today we are joined by authors Ada Hoffman and R.B. Lemberg to talk about their works with us. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, it's great to be here.
Hello, great to be here.
Well, before we jump into our actual book content, we like to start with a couple of introductory questions, starting with, has anything great happened lately? Anyone want to jump in? I'll start at once.
I organized my bookshelves, and by that, I mean I got halfway through organizing them and then got bored. So they're only half organized, but that is more than they were previously.
What's your system of organization?
It's very broad. So it's basically by subject matter, but not entirely accurate. So I have my nonfiction books, my academic studies books, my science fiction and fantasy that's where I got distracted. So they're all kind of a amorphous blob on the shelf. But yeah, it's just so that I have some idea of where to look when I'm looking for a book. But I don't know if it actually makes that much sense for anyone but me.
I'm jealous though. I've moved twice and not organized my books at all in between those. And so I have no idea where anything is.
Yeah, my books have been unorganized for the last 2 years, so it was time.
Well, my good thing is I'm up in Canada, and this week it's finally been warmer, and I was able to go out by the lake after work and see it because the ice melting.
Oh,
Yay.
That sounds lovely.
Yeah.
Oh, that's the best. Spring is so wonderful just because it's a little less sad.
Well, a lot of really terrible things are going on in my world because as many of my readers know, I'm from Ukraine and there's war in Ukraine going on. So it's been a bit heavy, but I'm very happy that today I've seen a photograph of the ARC of my next Birdverse book, The Unbalancing, held by a plush dinosaur in the office of my publisher, and the dinosaur was color matched to the cover.
Oh, I love that.
I'm very happy with that.
That's excellent.
Oh, that's wonderful. Mine is very silly. There was recently St. Patrick's Day. My friend made this incredible brunch and she had little place names and everything. It's the cutest thing. And so we had a small gathering, which is also kind of a nice experience.
Yeah, it's nice to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
That's great.
It was lovely. What is everyone drinking tonight? I'm drinking white tea, Silver Needle.
I am celebrating the warmer weather by drinking, it's a half rooibos tea, half homemade lemonade concoction.
Nice.
Because I have 2 very prolific lemon trees. So I try to use up those lemons.
I'm not an eating person, but I have kept myself up for the podcast by drinking my coffee, which is half hot chocolate, because I can only drink it when it's not sugary.
That's the best way to do it, though.
Uh-huh.
I'm sorry to say, but I'm drinking bourbon.
Oh, never apologize for that.
It's very uncharacteristic of me, but times are what they are. So
Yep.
Sometimes you just have to have a little bit of bourbon.
Yeah, sometimes, and this is that time. So
Oh, see, you're on my team because I'm the bourbon drinker here. Sarah's not a bourbon.
Bourbon is
fan.
Too sweet for me.
Yeah.
that's the good thing about bourbon, right?
No.
Yeah.
No. That's okay. You 2 can drink all the bourbon you want. I'll have the Scotch whiskey.
That is good too. You can put some in your tea, create a hot toddy.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe.
Yeah. Often.
Absolutely.
Well, since this is theoretically a book podcast, has anyone read anything good lately?
I have been reading the book Azura Ghost by Essa Hansen. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but Yes, that's it's the sequel to her first debut book, No Pet Gloss, which I'm also not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but
you pronounce it the same way we do. So
yes, it's a wonderful, very complex space opera, very, very detailed world building, very exciting plot. I'm really enjoying it. And there's not just a character in this one, which is kind of my specialty as a reviewer.
I loved those.
Yeah, we read them both for the podcast earlier this year, and they're just fantastic.
Okay, well, don't spoil them.
Nope. Won't say a word beyond they're very good.
The podcast comes out, I may or may not have finished. It's a very long book.
It is long.
I have to say that for the last few weeks, all I read is Ukrainian things. And I read Ukrainian war poetry in like as much as I can get my hands on, because I'm translating it now. So I've just been immersed in that world, and honestly, the work is astounding. And I wish the circumstances were different. The circumstances that brought this work to the world are terrible, but the work itself is amazing. So I have really enjoyed translating, which I've never done before.
Can you tell us a little bit about where we can find your translations?
Yeah, so I'm glad to. So I have there's a Ukrainian magazine, literary magazine, which is online, which is called Chitomo, and it's existed for a while. It's great. It has a Patreon and it publishes all things Ukrainian. And they have a Ukrainian edition and an English edition. And so when the war started, they began to publish a mini series of war poems, and they did a number of issues. And so I have a translation in issue 2 that came out last week, and I will have 3, I think, translations in the issue 3, which is coming out. The Ukrainian version is out already, so the English version is always about a week behind, more or less. So I have 3 poems accepted, and hopefully will be in that translations accepted. That will hopefully be in that issue. And I'm going to link them on Twitter. And I also have 2 translations in National Translation Month special issue of Ukrainian war poetry that has 2 parts, and one published today, and the other will come out on Monday, March 28th, which is probably going to be out by the time the podcast is ready.
That will be out by the time the podcast is out.
Right. So I'm happy to provide these links. These are just like a lot of very heartbreaking, hard-hitting stuff, but it's really worth it, and I feel that. I hope this poetry circulates widely, and I'm gonna catch up on my SFF reading later. Although I miss it, and I might dive back in sooner rather than later, because
it'll still be there.
I want to read. Yeah, it will, which is good.
Well, today we're talking about several different works, about half of which I've actually read. I'm sorry I was not able to read your entire bodies of work in the week preparing for this, but fully enjoyed what we did read.
Yeah, so for the podcast specifically, we read The Outside by Ada, and then The Four Profound Weaves by RB. Although, Ada, I know you also have The Fallen, which is the sequel to The Outside.
Yes.
And then RB, you have a large body of work. Yeah.
I have a large and strange body of work, yes.
A birdie of work, you might even say.
Ooh, I've not heard that one before.
I like that.
I'll use that.
Please do.
I will.
So initially, this whole podcast episode came about because RBU had tweeted that you were interested in finding a podcast that would host a conversation between yourself and Ada. And so we were kind of wondering, how do you two know each other?
Oh, God. Since the dawn of time.
I'm trying to remember, we've been writing friends since Slide Journal like 10 years ago.
Yes.
OG fandom. I love it.
Yes.
Yes, we've been, God, I actually don't remember how we met. Do you remember, Ada?
I think we met because of Bogey. I was friends with Bogey.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yes.
That makes sense. But we met before Bogey and I were together. Years before that.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Who knows?
I didn't expect it to be a trick question. I'm sorry.
No, it's not because the early days of LiveJournal, when, AI gods have blessed us with a LiveJournal. And I think we were hanging out talking about neurodivergence and books. And there were a bunch of people. Merck, Ada, you, me, Bogey.
Yeah, there were people.
Yeah.
Trying to remember back to the dawn of time.
The good old LiveJournal days.
Yeah.
Now I think I published your work in Stone Telling, but I don't remember what year it was that you first appeared in Stone Telling.
Yes, you published, I think, one poem of mine in Stone Telling, and it was the one called Stone Woman, which is a poem about like having autistic shutdown and you can't move. And it's like, it wasn't called Stone Woman, it was called Turning to Stone. I don't even remember the title of my own poems.
Yes, Turning to Stone, and it was in the Body issue.
Yes.
If I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Suffice it to say, you have known each other and been friends for a long time, it sounds like.
Yes.
Very long time. We've really been, I feel, invested in each other's work for a very long time.
Honestly, I was just curious because as we were writing questions for this episode, we were trying to come up with broad questions that apply to both works. And we were like, these books are so different. How do we do this? So we had to throw a curveball at you as well.
So is the question about how are books similar or?
Oh no, we figured it out. Don't worry.
Want to know.
Speaking of, in both of these works, there are multiple trans or autistic characters, respectively. And can you talk a little bit about how that allows you to more deeply explore the broad range of experiences that people go through?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, it's almost a tautology that when you have more than one autistic person, you can then explore more than one kind of autistic experience, and same with trans people. But if you want a specific example of how that happens in the outside, two of the autistic characters in the outside are Yasira Shan, the protagonist, and Eviana Talir, who is kind of an morally ambiguous antagonist who used to be Yasira's mentor. And the two of them are very different from each other. And when I first began to plan the outside, I wasn't sure if I wanted either of them to be autistic, because I was like, what if that's problematic? What if I have like this villain character being autistic and it turns out I'm implying something bad about autism? I really only put that in the book when I realized I couldn't avoid it, because the things that were interesting to me about these characters as they developed on the page were kind of inherently autistic things. They were things about sensory experience and things about being different from other people in particular ways. I couldn't really take that out of the book. I could choose to label it or not, but I couldn't take it out without ruining what I liked about the book. But what ended up happening once I more explicitly made them autistic and explored how that affected both of their lives is that you end up with this dynamic between two autistic people who grew up in two different cultures, who were treated two different ways because of their autism, and who have a lot in common and also a lot of very important disagreements because of that, and disagreements that they'll like argue about on the page. And I think, first of all, having a semi-villain and a hero both be autistic, it removes most of the concern about, an autistic villain, are you demonizing autism? But also the fact that they are able to have that commonality but also disagree. I think there's a danger of when you portray marginalized characters or when you talk about marginalized people's issues, you can kind of fall into the trap of assuming they're all a monolith, assuming they all have the same experience or the same feeling about some issue, and there's the autistic position on this issue, there's the trans position on this issue. But what's really happening when you immerse yourself in a community like that is there's commonalities, but there's also quite a lot of disagreement. So it was nice to be able to put that in the book.
And I think I really appreciated that about the outside. First of all, it's really rare to see mentorship relationship, especially among women, I think, with the woman mentor and the woman mentee. But also just the mentorship relationship is really hard to find outside of a mentor teaches you an important thing about life and dies. Which is probably my least favorite thing in the world, because I do a lot of mentoring, and so I don't want to envision myself and people like me as a disembodied voice of the long gone, no longer hovering over your shoulder, muttering into your ear some platitudes. I hate that trope. And so I think it was especially important for me to see a relationship between an autistic mentor and an autistic mentee, because I think that happens a lot. I think that neurodivergent people gravitate towards other neurodivergent people when they're looking for mentorship, also for friendship and for other experiences of community. But I thought it was just brilliant that both the protagonist and the anti-hero we're in a mentoring relationship, and both are autistic. And I think that does something really realistic, and I think the Fallen then expands on it much more, in that we see a kind of a support group almost of friends who all have some divergence, right? Mm-hmm. Who are all in some way not what we would perceive as neurotypical. And I think that's a very realistic for how our communities are in real life, and how we kind of find each other and support each other or disagree with each other, all those things. But it's hard to find in fiction. And so the same can be said about trans characters. I think that, judging from my own friend circle, there's a lot of trans people and a lot of neurodivergent trans people. And, I'm married to Boogie, who is a neurodivergent trans person, and our kid is neurodivergent, and God knows what his gender is. He's going to decide one day. And our friends and the kind of students that are in my office, and everything is implying that people like to cluster. And it's really difficult to find that vis-a-vis, fiction sometimes, because I think that up until recently, I think this trend is changing, and that's amazing and that's great. But up until recently, I think we would have like a token marginalized person in the surrounding of people who are not. So we would find a trans person surrounded only by cis people, or a queer person only surrounded by straight people, or one autistic person that is surrounded by neurotypicals. And that's not how it looks in real life. And honestly, it's pretty miserable to be the only one among people who are not, and who are more mainstream and not, or less marginalized. It is a position of kind of sadness. Yeah. And I think that for works that don't do that, it becomes a radical act almost, right? Where you kind of break that cycle of, now we have self-tokenized almost, right? We have that one person representing our experience, and the rest are representing somebody else's experience, dominant experiences. And so when you create, like in The Fallen, when you create community on the page and it mirrors communities in real life, I think that's incredible. So yeah.
Thank you. When you said autistic people gravitate to each other, I immediately remembered what we were just talking about how we first met. Because I remember back in those LiveJournal days, I had all these writing friends that I'd met back in those days, the little circle we had on LiveJournal, and people like you and Boogie, and people like Mark, and some others that I don't even remember who they were anymore. But I think I actually was friends with you on LiveJournal before you realized that you were, or at least before you publicly wanted to say that you were. Oh no,
Poland yelled at me. You were in that conversation. Poland yelled at me. Do you remember this?
I do not remember when Poland yelled at you.
Yeah, it happened. It happened when I was like, okay, my kid got diagnosed. This was very early days. This was literally ages ago. And my kid got diagnosed, and I was in the diagnostic process, and I'm like, this applies to me. This explains everything. And I began reading literature and and this happens to a lot of parents of autistic.
Oh yes, yeah, that happened to one of my parents actually.
Right, and it's super common. It's super duper common. First of all, it's genetic, right?
And I remember back in those days, I had this circle of people that I felt comfortable with, and I was friends with, or we vibed with each other's work for whatever reason, and just one after another, either it was them realizing, or it was them being comfortable talking about it, or it was whatever other combinations of things. But one by one, I was like, oh, these people are all autistic.
Yeah. So Poland came and said, and I was saying, okay, I don't. If I say that I'm autistic, I mean, I'm gonna take space. And Poland told me that I won't, and told me that it's really important not to be closeted on this aspect of my identity. And then, many years later, here we are. But those were the days.
LiveJournal was long enough ago that every time you say many years later, I'm just mentally adding 50 years, and now you're just like an ancient eldritch god in my head.
My kiddo was diagnosed when he's 2. It's a little bit scary.
Well, then this is before me, because I don't think I started publishing short fiction until like 2010.
Yeah, that was when I think started also.
Yeah, okay, wow. What is time?
2022.
It's not real. It's not real.
Right. Time is a lie. I forgot. Yeah, okay.
We were smaller. We were tinier.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
Well, speaking of real things, in the book The Outside, Ada, you use terms from the real world, while in the Four Profound Weaves, Arby, you use sort of your own in-world terminology. And I was just wondering what led to your decisions to either keep or change the language for these shared experiences.
Well, in Birdverse, they don't really speak English. I think that I don't know how clear it is for people who are not as linguistically obsessed as me. But they don't speak English, and so English terminology would not work for them. And our world terminology would only work for them up to a certain point. And there are many cultures in Birdverse, and each has culture-specific terms. So in my upcoming book, The Unbalancing, there's a specific terminology, not just for non-binary people, but for the 5 variations of non-binary people that they acknowledge in the culture. And there's all kinds of rituals and ways in which you self-select into the specific variations, and you come out as non-binary. And again, so I had to create those terms. I created those terms, or similar terms, separately for each culture. And that's kind of what makes me happy in my world building, is that I'm a linguist. And so I am, that's my kind of like non-writing reality, is that I'm a linguist. And I got to think about cultural linguistic world building and how each culture world builds, not just through its languages, but through multilingualism and contact with other cultures. And I sometimes wish that I could use our world, or, Earth, present day Earth words, because I think that when I write more realist fiction or more magic realist fiction, it's kind of much easier, because we already know the words. You don't need to teach the reader the new realities, the new words. You don't need to figure out how to immerse the reader, because they're already immersed. But that's the fun of fantasy world building. And I think that I would have made the same choice again if I were to do it again. But I think in science fiction, there's more of a leeway to use already existing terms. But Ada, I'll let you address that.
First of all, I'm really looking forward to the 5 variations of non-binary. But second of all, I didn't put nearly as much thought into it when I decided what words to use for autism or for trans people in The Outside. But I think kind of the underlying reasoning was The Outside is meant to take place in kind of the future of our world. So I will just have as much continuity as I can get away with, just to avoid confusing people.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the kind of future where, I mean, in some ways there's been change, because obviously we don't have computer gods controlling the world at the moment. But
are you sure?
Well,
Not yet.
We don't talk about it.
But also, I mean, one of the points of the world building in the outside is that the computer gods have been kind of keeping humanity under control and making sure that they don't develop in directions that would be too much, or that the computer gods don't want to happen for whatever reason. And so the science they're using is, the gods have all this stuff and warp drives and Ansible networks, but a lot of what the humans are using is just still 20th century stuff. So it makes sense, I think, especially in a future like that, to continue using 20th century words for people.
I did make a note the first time they refer to old Earth, because that's always my question in sci-fi, right? Mm-hmm. Is this just space, or is this humanity progressed? And so I was like, Earth, there it is.
Yes. Is it a galaxy far, far away, or is it our future?
Yeah, exactly.
Arby, you talked a little bit about this already, but the both of you, can you talk a little bit about how your educational backgrounds intersects with your world building and with how you build a story with your writing?
Yeah, everything is in a grab bag. And I think that I've had, kind of extreme life fluctuations that brought me to the point of beginning to write. I've been a migrant multiple times. I lived in 3 different countries before I came to the US. I went to school on 3 different continents. I read in multiple languages, and my undergrad is in linguistics and my grad is in linguistics. But I also did the folkloristics minor at the anthropology department at UC Berkeley with Alan Dundes, which reflects my lifelong fascination with folklore and mythology, which began when I was very, very small. So yeah, everything is in the grab bag. So everything I know, everything I do has potential to end up in my world building. And the reason, and people always ask me, what research do you do, RB? Well, I kind of do research every day. This is my brain that I must process large amounts of data every day. Nowadays it's mostly conversational data, but everything, I have an interest in material culture, and so I read and have always read very widely about decorative arts and trade. It's kind of like a special interest of mine to read about textile art and glassmaking and wood carving. And there's few categories of material culture that I'm especially interested in. And so those things make it into my work. Don't need to do special research. Do I do special research sometimes? Yes. If I don't know the English words for specific parts of threads, needles, shuttles, various parts of the loom, yes, I would read them, and I would read about these looms in English, and which I've done for the 4 Profound Weaves, because all my loom terminology was not in English before I started writing. So most of it was not in English. And then all the colors that people use for the dyes, I didn't know what they're called. And then I had to read a few books, more than a few books, about textiles and carpet making specifically, so that I would just know the English terminology. So that definitely qualifies as research. But mostly I don't do additional research because I already do research all the time. And so I can just use what I already know. In terms of linguistics, which is kind of subtle in my published work so far, but I have a novella that I hope will see the light of day one day very soon, which I'm revising now, which is all about linguistics. And so I hope that it will be out hopefully 2023, hopefully, maybe not. I'm trying not to jinx it from somewhere, and I have no idea who's going to take it in the end. But I'm confident in it. I love it. And so that one will have just tons of linguistics on the page. But in terms of linguistics that I do in my work, it's more of I wonder how that would work, I have a question about linguistics, and so I solve it by writing about it, how that would work, what that would look like. So that's kind of it, I think.
Is the novella that you have coming out also Birdverse, or is it unrelated?
Well, it's not yet coming out because it hasn't been accepted yet.
Right.
We're speaking it into existence.
Yes.
That will come out.
Yes.
Birdverse. Oh yeah, it's Birdverse. It's Birdverse. Birdverse. I'm not leaving my favorite playground. Oh no. I mean, I'll write other things, and I've written many other things, but Birdverse is my heart, and it's my special interest, and so it's I have the distinct pleasure of populating it with people, world building, details, problems, and tidbits that interest me. So I'm not going from it. So it's going to be there.
I'm very happy to get more Birdverse.
I'm so glad to hear. Well, you'll read The Unbalancing. I'll
Yes.
see what you think about that.
Yeah, I have it pre-ordered.
Great.
So for me, my educational background is not nearly as all over the place. I have a PhD in computer science. And specifically, what I studied for my PhD is cognitive science, and in particular, how you would get a computer to be creative and how you would tell you had succeeded at that if you had made a computer creative or not. So people ask me, oh, do you use your computer science background in your novel about computer gods that have taken over the world? And I have to say, really, I use less of it in my writing than people think that I must, because my actual scientific opinion is that we are nowhere near the level of AI where it would take over the world in this manner. People talk about it, but there are so many basic things about how the mind works that we are nowhere close to modeling even a little bit of on a computer. And the much more pressing issue in terms of computers having power over people is really a question of governments or corporations giving responsibilities to these algorithms they've made up that then carry on with the same unthinking biases and injustices that the people who created them were already a part of. That's what we need to be worried about. So when I write about the computer gods, I'm really just writing about the science fiction tropes that I grew up with. And they really just form kind of, I don't know. But where I do find that my background in academia comes a little bit more into the book is, first of all, when I'm writing about how it feels for these characters who are academics themselves, how it feels to have a mentor who's been supervising your graduate work, what that relationship is like, or what the daily work of a researcher is like, and what you're going around and trying to figure out. And also, I think it comes out in little details of how I write about how the characters interact with computers. Like Yasira has kind of this fun thing happen to her that first she's laboriously working on a human space station with like basically 20th century technology plus a fancy thing that she invented. And then she gets spirited away to work with the angels, who are like cyborgs that work for the computer gods. And all of a sudden, everything's very futuristic and the user interfaces are completely different. And she's like, oh, how do I use this new user interface? And I geeked out a little bit writing that part. So, but as for other research that we do for the books, I find myself really, I think the parts that I do the most research into for my books are the parts that are least like what I do as an academic. So for the outside, I mean, hopefully it's not a spoiler to say many terrible things happen to the characters in this book. And so it was very helpful in this book to have read Judith Herman's book, Trauma and Recovery, which is like how psychological trauma works. And it was also very useful to this wasn't a specific book, but just to read as widely as I could into just the basics of how mysticism works, because there was quite a lot of mysticism in this book. For the Fallen book 2, hopefully this is not a spoiler. For book 2, one of the most useful books that I read was by Rebecca Solnit. It was called A Paradise Built in Hell. And this is a book about how people respond after natural disasters and how communities kind of informally come together to support each other and how people survive in that way. And I drew a lot on what I'd read for that book when I was kind of writing the situation that the characters are in that book.
For no reason at all. You read it just for fun. It had nothing to do with anything that happens in the books at all.
I try to to be subtle, and sometimes I fail.
No, I think you nailed it.
Yes.
I think anything that's on the back of the books is like, it's fine.
Yeah, it's on the back
that's,
of the
that's
books.
fair game.
Yeah.
I think that's also one of the things I really appreciated about Ada, your books in the Outside series so far, is that kind of I always feel like the Outside is more about trauma, although not purely, but the Fallen is more about the aftermath and kind of the CPTSD almost experience of, okay, we've been traumatized. We've been really traumatized. And now there's a whole new book of adventure that's also going to traumatize us even more, maybe.
Yeah.
I'm not spoilering, I hope.
I mean, any book tagged cosmic horror, I think you know what you're getting into.
And I find it also really realistic that I do think that a lot of neurodivergent experiences overlap with experiences of trauma just because of how the world tends to treat neurodivergent people. And I just think that it's so, it was so soothing almost. I mean, that's the wrong word, right? For me to read it as a neurodivergent person with CPTSD, it was soothing for me to read that, yeah, we still get adventures. We still get to be protagonists, right? Yeah. So I think that's also something that I tackle in my work as well. So that's definitely a commonality.
Actually, Arby, earlier you mentioned your background in folklore, and I just have to say that there's one moment that I'm not going to specify that gave me such Selkie vibes. It was so cool. And it was very subtle, but just the whole general situation there. I was like, oh, I feel this happening right now. And it was very cool.
Interesting. I have not actually thought about Selkies, but about the 4 profound waves, I think that I'm not gonna reveal any terrible truths if I'll say that this work is folkloric. And I meant it to be folkloric work because for many years I was thinking, well, I know so much folklore, I teach so much about folklore and folklore theory, and I've never actually used it intentionally. It's always there in my work because I think about it, but it's never intentionally used. And so when I was working on the 4 profound weaves, I kind of challenged myself to construct a narrative which would not mirror, but utilize elements of fairy tale structure, the 31 functions of the fairy tale of prop identified by prop. And many of the moves, especially in the first third of the book, are a fairy tale structure. They follow things like misfortune or lack are made known, hero leaves home, then we get to the donor, the mentor was Ben Seret, and I'm not gonna spoiler it. But I think with Ben Seret, I got to write a real mentor / donor, magical mentor / donor figure as it appears in folklore. This person's terrifying. This person will eat you. This person will kill you. This person will ask you strange questions that you will not know how to answer. And the outcome of your encounter with that mentor figure is uncertain. And that is extremely folkloric. And I think that over the evolution of how the Western civilization, broadly construed, has softened and kind of
Disneyfied.
Yeah, made the whole test by the donor much more pretty and much less toothy than it is in most fairy tales that I know, right? And I really liked it. And so while I was doing it, I was putting in other folkloric motifs and images that I personally always was a fan of and to which I have a connection through my own cultures. And so there's a lot of it in the 4 profound weaves. And some people have called it a fairy tale. Some people have caught on to it. So and it's funny because the unbalancing, even though it has a lot of folkloric elements, is not built on the structure of a fairy tale. And it happens much earlier on the timeline, but it feels more modern to me because it doesn't have that, okay, we're moving along on the fairy tale structure kind of feel.
Yeah, I think for me, the 4 profound weaves definitely had that very kind of dreamlike quality that you find in a fairy tale. I mean, there are bad things that happen. It's not, as Lily says, it's not the Disney version, but it's very definitely a beautiful fairy tale.
Oh, thank you. I mean, Disney is not folklore. I mean, folklore.
Right.
Disney is a commercial enterprise that draws on folklore to create commercially viable.
That's what so many people associate with these stories now, and they've forgotten sort of the source, the really dark source of a lot of them, or at least a lot of people I know.
So with Russian folklore, the Father Frost, the Moroska, when Moroska is doing, trials for the two girls, the good girl, as she's freezing in the forest, is being asked by the Father Frost, "Are you warm, beautiful girl?" And she's supposed to say, "I am warm." And in fact, she does. She's freezing to death. And she's given the right answer. And so in the end of these many repetitions of, "Are you dying?" No, I'm good. she's finally helped. She's passed the test. Whereas the so-called evil sister is more outspoken and says, "I'm freezing." "I'm freaking freezing in here, old man. What are you thinking? Why are you even asking me this?" And so she dies. Because she does not give Father Frost the correct answer. This is fairy tales. It's not the Disney version. I mean, even in Andersen's version of The Little Mermaid, which is not in any way directly folkloric because it's authored and he wrote it himself, the Little Mermaid, walks on sharp knives in order to be with a guy who doesn't want her, and in the end turns into foam. And yet here we have Ariel, Yes, and her little fishy friends.
These two books, or the two books that I have read, are both part of larger bodies of work, but in different ways. One is the first book of a series, whereas the other one is sort of one part of a larger universe. And I was wondering how it's different, writing stories sort of in these different narrative structures.
I think if you want to know how the process is different, then you would have to ask someone who has written in both ways. So it might not be as productive a question to ask to two different people. With The Outside and The Fallen, and actually with The Infinite, which is book 3 in that series, which will hopefully come out in early 2023. I just handed in the manuscript for that book in March. That's the trilogy. And certainly when I began The Outside, I was like, this is great. This universe is great. I want to just write this universe for a very long time. But now it's been a very long time because each book took me a couple of years to write. And I'm looking at these 3 books now and I'm like, you know what? Yeah, 3 books in that universe. That's enough. I want to do something else now. And I think what happens, and I'm gathering from what I've heard from you, RB, over the years, is that when you are writing something like Birdverse, it's very different. The Birdverse is just kind of where you want to be forever, I think. And with Birdverse, it seems to me that you're not always telling the same story, but you're finding new corners of the universe and new stories in the universe to explore.
So I wish I could write a sequence. I really do, because that, I think, stood between me and publishing those works for many years, because mainstream publishing does not really deal well with things that are deviant. And so consistent feedback that I would receive from my work is they love the world building, but they are not sure that this is the first book. Well, nothing is ever going to be the first book, and nothing. So build that way. And so I think the power of Birdverse is not to have linearity. It's not a linear, I mean, in some way it's a linear progression. There's some linear progression. I know the beginning and I know the end of the arc, but there are things outside the arc. In fact, the Four Profound Weaves is connected to the main arc through one person. No, okay, more than that, but the carpet, there's a carpet that connects, right? So it's kind of like, it's a tapestry. And people have used that word to describe my work, and I think it's apt, because I want to see how things are interconnected much more than I want to see them sequenced on a line. My mind is not linear, and I construct my worlds in a kind of model of interconnectedness, which is what's intriguing to me in all aspects of everything that I do. And it's kind of a brain thing where things are interconnected, and I gravitate towards very complicated problems. Like in my academic life, I want to write about multilingualism, and I want to write about gender, and I want to write about like other things. So, and there are people who gravitate towards many, things which are intersectional, which have complexity, and which take forever to untangle. And it's harder to produce research if you're, tackling things that are very, 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 very complicated. But it's cool. And the same is true for fiction for me. I like to write multiple things from different angles. So, for example, the myth of birdverse coming into being by bird coming to the landmass carrying the 12 stars in her tail. I have written, a bunch of versions. The Unbalancing has a bunch of things about this. And the novella, which is in revisions, linguistics novella, will have a completely different viewpoint, and so will other works, because just that one event has been perceived extremely differently by different participants in the event. And that's where the fun is for me. I want to know how these stories changed, or were not even the same stories about the same thing, because I see it in real life. And that too is folkloric, because in folklore, items have multiple existence. So in one culture, you have Selkie stories. In the other culture, you have the bear, that is the bridegroom or the bride, in yet other cultures, you have intermarriage between the humans and the dogs. And the dogs are better. So, the dog people, they're much better. They're better behaved and have better table manners and humor than human Siberian folklore. It's lovely. So it's kind of like, okay, you have all these variants, but you are talking about the same experience of othering and kind of relationship in which othering happens, and what do you do with it. And that's kind of where I am with birdverse. So I want to write something linear. I don't know if I will ever do that. So watch the space, because if I will ever manage to write something linear, I will certainly talk about it.
Sarah, why should you read these books?
So you should read The Outside if you want really compelling science fiction with a dash of Lovecraftian horror and a wonderful and complicated mentor relationship and a great depth to the characters. And you should read The Four Profound Weaves if you want a beautiful, queer, lyrical fairy tale.
Perfect. Usually this is where I jump in, but I think you nailed it. To avoid spoilers, skip to 1:17:14. I'm going to cut this instead of trying to spoiler tag it, but it was the rug that one of the main characters gives to his lover, and she says, "Let me just keep this safe for you. You can have this maybe later." That just had like really Selkie vibes to me. That was all.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of like it's kind of a tale type thing where this motif where your beloved holds your true self captive in order for the relationship to continue, that is a tale type, and it's the tale type of marriage with a supernatural animal lover. And there's a number of tales like this. I mean, they're super popular in the world. And the idea is that the human partner needs to hide the skin of transformation from the other partner, the partner from the other world. Because if that skin is not hidden, the partner is going to run away. And it's often appears in fairy tales which are not discussed and not put on by Disney, fairy tales of divorce, in which the otherworldly partner has enough, doesn't like this, steals their freaking skin, and goes away. Often with all the magic cattle that they've brought into the relationship. So I've been really interested in these kind of folklore of marital dissolutions, because It's not often discussed. It's a very wide, many cultures have it. And a lot of it is about you have mistreated your spouse. You have mistreated your spouse, and now the spouse is going to go. and they're going to go into the lake, into the sea, into the forest, back to the dog people, whatever the tradition is, right? But with the four profound beliefs, again, so this is a spoiler, right? So it's in the spoiler section. I think with the four profound beliefs, and what I kind of get out of these tales is that it's a lack of trust that ruins a relationship, and it's a lack of acceptance of the person who has the skin, who is the original owner of the skin, not trusting them to want you if they still have their skin, and assuming that they will only want you if you take a vital part of them away. And this is what those abusive relationships are made of. And in the four profound weaves, it's a queer relationship that is abusive in this way. I mean, it's a certain kind of abuse. It's very loving in many ways because both partners feel that they love each other. But there's an element of abuse in that the continuous coercion of the trans partner to remain closeted up until the cis partner dies. And I think that is not folkloric, because if it was folkloric, then the trans partner would just get up and leave, and maybe not voluntarily surrender their cloth, but have their cloth removed from them by force. That would be folkloric. But I think what makes this queer for me is the fact that it was freely given, and that it was kind of like, here, I care about you, so I want you to kind of process it and be okay with me being trans. And the other partner never is. And I talked to Corey about this book a lot. Corey is my friend who is no longer with us. And we kind of talked about how it mirrors some of our experiences of cis queer women not accepting trans partners as they come out, which is, I think, less common now than it was back in the day, which is great. But then the whole turf aspect of it, and the whole, you cannot be a trans masculine person. You cannot possibly come out. Like, why do you need to be trans? And I feel that it really such as a kind of intra-community thing that's really bitter and really terrible, and hopefully is on the way out, although I don't know if it is.
We can hope. Seems like it's trending up, or
it's
better.
It's getting better. It's definitely better
over time.
Yeah, it's definitely better than it was, and so it's kind of interesting to me that I wrote it as an old person's problem, where the world was different, and now maybe it's changing, but it's an old person's problem.
Well, and I think that it's you contrast it with, there's another relationship or another woman in the Four Profound Weaves who had a partner who identifies as trans, and she is supportive of her partner. Yeah. And he eventually goes and resides with the men.
Yeah.
So it's not universally an old person's problem.
Well, no, but Sulika, who is that person who's the mentor to the protagonist, and who used to be a friend and mentor to the protagonist, who turns out had a trans partner, but she's never told anyone.
Yeah, that's true.
She's never told Nancy Sayer. She's never told the nameless man about this. He thought he was all alone.
Mm-hmm.
And he finds out that obviously there are many trans people, and there are many trans people in the Hana culture. They're just hidden, and it's an unspoken reality. But yeah, Sulika was loving to her partner, to her trans partner, and accepted him, even though it ultimately meant that he would be living with a man on the men's side of the city, and that would be basically it for them, being together, being a part of a trading group, having their lives very closely intertwined. That went away, but she was accepting. And so that that just tells us that nothing is universal. Even if a culture is not accepting as a whole, there'll be people who will be accepting and people who won't be, even if the culture is accepting.
Yeah, nothing is a monolith.
Yeah.
So through the power of editing, we just heard Arvi talk a little bit about some influential works and concepts. And Ada, I was wondering, you had sort of mentioned some pop culture influences, and I was wondering if you'd name a few, or if there were anything in particular that influenced The Outside.
Oh gosh, let me try to remember what I was talking about. Was this when I was talking about AI computer gods that control the world?
It was, but if there was something that influenced you outside of that. Okay.
Yeah. The funny thing is that although there are, of course, many science fiction stories about a computer that becomes intelligent and tries to take over the world, I mean, even outside of movies and stories, there are people like Ray Kurzweil who make their entire brand out of, telling the future, being like, hey guys, computers are going to take over the world. But where I actually took the AI gods from initially, and this is extremely dorky, it's the dorkiest thing about the entire Outside series. But what happened when I was first coming up with the world of The Outside is that I wanted to write about some Dungeons and Dragons characters.
I love that.
A copy was originally a Dungeons and Dragons character, and Ysera wasn't, but a couple of other characters originally were.
Which edition?
3.5. This is a while ago.
Deva? What? I need to know. What was the character? Do you remember?
All right. No, a copy was a changeling sorcerer who eventually went to work with the devils and became one of the villains of the story. But never mind. So I was like, all right, I want to write about these D&D characters, but I am much too proud to write D&D fantasy with the serial numbers filed off. I know you can't do that. And I know that's not a viable career move. I'm not going to do that. So how do I take these D&D characters and put them in the least D&D-like thing possible? And I'm like, well, what's the least D&D-like thing possible? And then I'm like, what? Space opera. So then I was like, all right, so I'm going to write these characters in a space opera, but I have to keep the things that make them recognizably those characters. And part of that was their relationship to larger spiritual forces. And I was like, all right, well, what's the most fun and least D&D-like way to put larger spiritual forces that control the world and are sometimes evil into a space opera? And I was like, you know what? Computer gods. So that was my process.
I think that's incredible because I've read some books that were inspired by a D&D campaign. And even though they changed some things, it still has that D&D feel, but this does not have that at all. So you did an incredible job at translating it.
I filed off the serial number so hard they ended up in space.
Yeah. Actually, something that I was wondering if you had either consciously or unconsciously taken inspiration from was the Theodicy stories for children. Gave me a very strong Rudyard Kipling vibe. Just So stories. Okay.
Yes. It's not the only influence I used for that particular section's writing style, but it was a big one. Yeah.
Yeah. I haven't read those stories in a long time, but I immediately
beloved.
Yeah. I immediately thought of that.
I was wondering if during the process of writing these books or in general, and this is the spoiler section, if there was a particular trope or trend that you wanted to crush, just completely negate or do better.
Well, in general, I don't really write out of spite very often. So I don't really usually think in terms of crushing tropes. One thing that I did want to work with in a very critical manner, maybe we'll say it that way, is the trope of, this is kind of inherent to cosmic horror, is the trope of, oh, well, I saw this terrible cosmic horror thing and then I went mad. And it's like, this is kind of a very integral trope to cosmic horror, but it's usually done in this incredibly lazy, ableist way. And I was like, well, I started thinking about what do I want to do with that? And what I ended up thinking, and this is why I ended up researching psychological trauma for the book. I mean, aside from the fact that I just inherently like to write about trauma, but I was thinking, what do we have in real life where, just by seeing or hearing or experiencing the wrong thing, you can have a mental illness after that. Well, that's what PTSD is. Like literally, that's what that's the real world analog of this trope of going mad from the revelation of something. So I was like, you know what, I'm going to lean into that, and I'm going to write about the process of being someone who is already neurotypical, but who is accruing trauma and is becoming more non-neurotypical because of that, and is becoming less and less something that the world around them is equipped to understand. And like, how do you actually deal with that rather than just, gibbering or something?
I sometimes wonder if some, at least early cosmic horror stories were about the kind of a fear of mental illness and othering mental illness while being fascinated by mental illness. And I think more modern narratives, very much including yours, Ada, are kind of looking more compassionately and also more, there's like closer interaction with mental illness as not something that is othered, but that's something that's part of life. And that's something that is very, relevant, is very relatable, is vital, and is very much not a process of othering.
Yeah, and I think that's very true, and I think that's also analogous to how other groups have been treated in cosmic horror. The origins of cosmic horror are incredibly racist, and in recent years we've seen a number of wonderful authors of color doing their own takes on cosmic horror from the viewpoints of the marginalized racial groups, real or fictional, in cosmic horror. People like Sylvia Moreno Garcia or Victor Labelle or Ruthana Emrys. And that's not the approach I took with my book because it's not really my lane, but it's the same thing where you have initially something that the original authors of cosmic horror were both fascinated by and strongly othering and prejudiced against. And then you have those actual people coming and telling their own version of it with a lot more compassion.
So can you repeat the question, Lily, if you don't mind?
Yeah. You actually already answered it, which is what made me think of it. You gave me this question when you mentioned the dead mentor trope.
Oh yeah.
Are there any others?
I think that in the Four Profound Leaves, I specifically wanted to. I don't see myself as a super tropey writer, although I've embraced some tropes in the unbalancing just for the fun of it. But I wanted to write something that will not be a romance and that has two main characters who are very, very invested in each other and become very, very close. And yet there is no romance between them. And it's not because they're old, because I write old people fall for each other and for younger people all the time, right? But this was not it. And I think that it was interesting to see how people kind of sometimes expected them to end together, which, spoiler territory, they're together. They're friends. They are, they're committed to continuing their close friendship, but they're not going to be together, which is not an identity statement in this case as much as it is narrative statement, that we don't have, in my opinion, enough stories about friendship, close friendship, that is just not going to be something else. It's just going to be, an evolution of a friendship, of a very close friendship. And in the unbalancing, that's not how I wrote it, because it does have romance elements, and a few are quite tropey, and I put them on purpose. I wanted to have a queer people save the cat moment, and in fact, it is there. The cat is pretty much self-saving, but it's okay. But in my novella, which I'm revising, again, there is going to be two characters who do not get together and who have a very close, by the end, relationship. I'm spoiling it. They don't in the beginning, but they do in the end. And I think this is something really important for me to write in my world, in that I enjoy romantic storylines as a reader and a writer, and I enjoy non-romantic storylines as a reader and a writer. And I think that often authors are pigeonholed as one or the other. Either you write romance subplots or even like romance in general, or you don't. But I want to do both because it's the kind of a part of diversity of human experience that I wanted to have in Birdverse, and I'm committed to continuing having it there.
Both books get pretty dark at times. How do you decide, or when do you decide to either lean in or pull back on some of that darkness?
I'm making faces because I don't know how to answer this.
I mean, if it's just an instinctual thing, and there is no answer, that's fine too.
My first experience, the first thing I ever written back in the days of Live Journal, which was never published, and that's fine. And I wrote this very, very interesting to me scene, which I didn't perceive as especially dark. And everybody who read it was like, oh my God, RB, you write horror so well. I was terrified. Okay. And I often feel that my stories are not, in fact, dark when other people perceive them as dark. And for me, perhaps that's because I personally never lose hope. And even though my characters go through extremely dark, for other people, experiences, they're not that dark for me. Which says something about my life experience, which we can explore, or maybe in therapy. Okay.
Or you just know that it's going to have a happy ending, which is cheating.
Well, and I think that's my thing as a trauma survivor and as a person who's been through very, very dark things in my life, is that I know that when I'm writing characters going through extremely dark things, I'm gonna lead them through to a better place. They will not be unscarred. They will not be maybe, remade into a happy and completely, well-adjusted and able-bodied 20-year-olds. That's not going to happen, right? They're going to be scarred and they're going to be limping and they're going to be suffering from PTSD, but they're going to have hope in the end. And I think that's why I don't feel that my work is dark enough. And I often wonder if it needs to be darker. And then sometimes people say, oh, this goes into such dark places. Okay. Yeah, kind of it does, but it doesn't end there. And for me, that's what matters the most. I think that if I ever lost hope in my ability to lead my characters through the very narrow places and out of these very narrow places, then I would write horror. And I hope that moment never comes.
Oh, well, the perfect example of that is that staff, because the soul-eating staff, which is horrifying, but it does have a almost, even just for that like little moment, almost a happy ending, and you do kind of come out of it feeling like it, the friend is going to go find it. It's kind of sweet.
Yeah, it has a happy ending for the staff, actually.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a terrible thing because they can never regain their life. They can never not be a part of the terrible torturing staff. But when I think about it, I also think about, that staff in particular was not in the original version that I wrote and submitted Tachyon. It was much shorter. And there was maybe one line about the staff. It was there, but it was very brief. That there was a staff of faces and all these faces are screaming. And they told me, well, we want the book to be longer, which is great. I can write forever. So when I was thinking, well, what am I going to put in it? And then the figure of the torturer was something that really interested me, because the torturer is a person who is in service of evil, right? Who chooses to be in the service of evil, and whose whole family, and this is spoiler, whose whole family is in the rod, and who feels very strongly that they're safer in the rod than alive. And that's a part of my kind of whole thing where I want to go deeper and deeper into family systems trauma, and the kind of trauma that families, quote unquote, lovingly inflict upon other family members who may be less powerful than them. kind of like, I know better what's good for you, even though it means that you're going to literally be dead and a part of a magical road that eats other people. But I know, because I'm going to keep you in my hand. You'll be close. I will always have you close. And I kept thinking about that staff and what it meant and the people who were in the staff. And I wondered, what would a better ending look for them? And kind of that's what came out of it. There's a kind of a trend in my work, not just Birdverse, but there was this epic poem that I wrote that was horror, that's called Long Shadow, that's in Strange Horizons many years ago. And it's so long, I think only a few people read it through it.
I liked it.
Yay! So I wish Long Shadow was a story and not a poem, because I think it would have worked better, but I couldn't do it. I just couldn't sustain it, because that one does not have much hope. There's no hope. I mean, there's some hope, but it's so amorphous that you can't even imagine what it is. And in that poem, I think I expressed the sentiment: some wrongs can never be undone. Some wrongs become life, which was a repeating line in the poem. That sometimes the atrocities, in the case of Long Shadow, atrocities of war. In the case of the staff, the atrocities that family members can inflict upon others, those are not wrongs that can be undone. But there's still some chance for them to become life, to become a part of a different story or continuation of a story, that it doesn't have to be the end. And I don't think that it's necessarily all that hopeful, but there's some sliver, or there's something that is hopeful in that end. So thank you so much for talking about it, because I always wonder what are people thinking about the staff?
Oh, horrifying, but beautiful.
So I was thinking more about the question you asked initially about how you decide, when to lean into the trauma or pull back. And I realized why I was having trouble with this question. It's because the way I work in my writing process is that, I outline some, and I know where the story is going to end up, and I know the important things that are going to kind of happen externally in terms of events and actions on the way to there. But the emotional responses that the characters are having in those moments, those are things I'll have glimpses of moments, but the journey that the character takes through the moments, and really a lot of the chewy stuff about what the character's thinking and how they move through this and how they're processing what they're feeling. I don't know most of that until I start writing it, until I have it on the page. And so very frequently it will be an experience for me where Like, oh yeah, this is going to happen. That'll be pretty cool and exciting and a little scary, I guess. And then I get to it and I'm actually writing it. I'm like, whoa. I didn't realize what that was going to feel like. And I guess what I do in those moments is mostly I just go with it, and I go with what feels right in that moment, now that I've written myself into this moment. And then, obviously in revisions, if people are like, oh no, this is too much, or, this needs to be punched up more. Obviously you can listen to that in revisions the way you listen to any editor or beta reader feedback, but it's not something I really think about a lot when I'm planning.
I just think back to the torture scene and how you sort of zoom in to very brief moments, but it's mostly that sort of zoomed, we don't actually see what's physically happening, but we know that it is. Mm-hmm. Sort of that that balance combination was really excellent.
Okay, well, I'm glad I don't know if liked is the right word, but I'm glad that worked.
You can say I liked it. I'm a horror fan. It's fine.
Yeah.
Out of curiosity, and if it's like picking a favorite child, you can tell me that you're not going to answer. Do either of you have a favorite moment to write, or that you're just most proud of from the work?
No, I don't think I can pick one.
All right, fair.
No, it's hard to pick just one. But again, this is spoiler territory. Mm-hmm. So I think for me, the most profound moment in the Four Profound Leaves is when Wizia is fully committed and alone with the bones and the voices of the bones. And she says, I listen to my sisters. I'm misquoting myself probably. And she hears all the stories as they're being unspooled almost from the bones. And I think I've rewritten that scene because at first I had kind of like experimental structure where each voice was marked in a slightly different font. And that didn't quite work. And so I had to rewrite it to kind of narrativize a little more how the different voices sounded and what they said. And I still don't know if it's where I really want it to be, but I think it worked. In the end, it worked for me, where I really was trying to portray a moment of listening. So yeah, probably that one.
That scene made me cry. So personally, for me, it worked very well.
It was a really good scene.
Yeah.
Yay. It's also really dark because the scene is really dark because to get to that point, she's completely cut off from the outside world. She's injured. She has no way to move herself, her own body. She doesn't have mobility on her own at that point very much. I mean, she can move, but she's not doing that great with her mobility at the moment. She's exhausted, she's injured, and she's just gone through trauma. And the door is closed and she's not looking to get out. So that's kind of like when you face the darkest possible moment, and that's the moment when she's listening, she's hearing, and she's listening the voices of the bones and the stories of the bones. And so that is kind of like a horror moment, right? Because that is a horror moment, and yet it's not horror, right? Because that's when it matters, right? That's when everything kind of comes together. And that's how she can learn the weave of death.
It affected me the opposite way because I thought it was very sweet that all of those souls had their moment and they finally had someone listening to them. I thought that was a nice moment. Maybe that just shows that I'm more of a horror reader.
No, I don't think, I think it's a very legitimate reading, and I think it's a good reading. But one of the reasons I always think Sérénade never got to that moment and never learned the weave of death, despite her like tremendous craft mastery. I mean, she knows the weave of death, so she just has never produced a masterpiece in the particular weave, and that's what bothers her. That she's the weave of death woman. She's the one with the weave of death, and yet she's never produced a masterpiece. And her masterpiece is the masterpiece of hope, which is she does not like that. She does not like that. But the reason she doesn't is because she doesn't care that deeply to listen, and she doesn't care enough to make the journey. Maybe she will now. I don't know. Maybe not. So I think that I can't write horror, maybe, because everything is a bit hopeful. So, Ada, can I ask you something?
Sure.
So, I am really interested in the infinite.
Mm-hmm.
And without spoiling, maybe, because nobody has read that book yet, except you and your editors, I think, and maybe you alpha and beta readers.
A couple of alpha readers.
Yeah. So can you maybe tell us a tiny little bit about this book and what to expect?
Okay, so without spoilers, that's the problem.
Okay, maybe with some spoilers, okay.
All right, if this is too many spoilers, you can just remove the whole thing, but I'm going to say it with as few spoilers as I can and have it still make sense. So at the end of The Fallen, the characters have, at great cost, achieved a lot of what they set out to do, and they have, achieved some victory, but in response to that victory, the gods are like, oh, well, the Kyrios, who's the bad god, is now going to come and basically destroy everything, and good luck with that. Like, the gods are basically just having a shit fit, and that's how they respond. And so the infinite starts out with the characters trying to figure out how on earth not on earth because they're not on earth, but how they are going to deal with this, and what resources do they actually have to meet a fight of something against something with that much power. And Eviana Talir comes back I'm not super happy yet with how her arc is in the draft. So that's probably going to change. I want her to have a little bit more to do, but she definitely has some ideas for how they can deal with this, but the other characters do not like. And in the process of dealing with this, the characters find out some more terrible secrets of things the gods have been hiding from them. And they eventually triumph, of course. Is that a spoiler? This is quite a difficult active description without describing too much. And we also have a section which I hope my editors will let me keep, because I really enjoyed myself with this particular section. But there is a section where we actually see what happened 700 years before the novel began, when the gods were just beginning to arise. We see some of the origins of the gods. So that should be a lot of fun.
Oh, that sounds fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Thank you.
You send them to us if they try to make you cut it.
Yeah. We will insist. You have to keep it.
Well, if they cut it, please post it in a newsletter.
Yeah, if they cut it, then I mean, I don't think they'll cut it. I'm just talking out of my mouth right now. But if it didn't fit in the book, I would just make it into a novelette or something, like on its own. I'd be like, here, guys.
Well, that was the perfect segue into us asking about what your current projects are, what you're working on right now. Like, what do we have to look forward to? I think I know the answer from Ada.
Well, you have the infinite to look forward to. I've been trying to shop around a second short story collection. I published one in, I think, 2017. I'm trying for another one. We don't know if anyone's going to be interested in publishing it yet. As for what's next after the Outside series, I just handed in the manuscript of book 3 in the beginning of the month. So I have a few vague thoughts of what I would like to do next, which is very different from the current series, but I don't want to say it yet because it's all still very unformed, very up in the air. So RB, I assume what's coming next for you is more Birdverse.
Hey, okay, so well, the Unbouncing is going to be out in September. In June, I will have another book coming out, which is my poetry memoir called Everything Thaws, about growing up in Ukraine. Yes, and that is not Birdverse, and it is about Soviet Jews, climate change, and trauma, trauma of Stalinist repressions and the Holocaust. And so it's strangely timely. I don't know. It's a terrible thing, but it's strangely timely. And it's my first non-spec big work. I mean, I've written others, but it's a first big non-speculative work that is going to be published. So I'm really curious what people think about it. Beyond those two, I also have a short story collection that is looking for a home, and I hope to maybe have some news about that. Nothing is happening, but maybe. And revising this novella that I'm super excited about. And after I finish revising the novella, I am working on a few, longer Birdverse projects. And one of them is also very heavily about linguistics. So I hope that one is going to coalesce sooner rather than later. I've been working on it for a long time. It's very dear to me, and I just need to stop obsessing about it. It's a bad word. I don't know. I rephrase. I just need to be a little bit more. I need to let go a little bit of how perfect I want it to be, because it's not going to be perfect. It's a very complex book, and it's not going to be perfect. So I need to let go of that expectation a little bit, that I'm going to make everything exactly the way I want it and just move forward with it. And then I just figured out yet another Birdverse project that I've been working on for a while. I just figured out where it went wrong, which is super exciting for me. And basically where it went wrong was, I'm going to just tell you because I'm excited about it. Where I went wrong is when I thought that one character had this kind of like really terrible mystic vision and is doing semi-unethical things because of that vision. That character wouldn't do it. That character just wouldn't do it for many complex reasons, not because that character is a goody two shoes. On the contrary, that's an anti-hero character, but that character just wouldn't do it. And so I've been chewing on it. And turns out that a character who actually does it is the goody two shoes character.
Oh, well then. That's interesting.
And when I figured it out, a lot of things fell into place for me. And so I need to revise it with that in mind, because that's going to have an implication for the whole book, and it's going to solve the issues that I had with it. So super excited, and hopefully I will have time to work on all those projects. Time is always in short supply.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Arby, but I think I saw a Twitter thread that you posted about you were working on a piece that discusses how Russia under the Soviet regime barred translations of feminist SFF.
Yes. So that's an academic book. It's going to be very accessible to read, I hope. I don't know. But it's an academic project. It's about gender and translations, basically about how to translate books that deal with gender in two languages. One of them has a very complex grammatical gender system. Russian has to mark everything masculine, feminine, or neuter, and neuter is mostly for objects. And English doesn't need to do that, except for pronouns. So in 1980, there were two translations of science fiction novels that deal with forests. One of them is the brothers Strugatsky's Snail on the Slope, and the other is Ursula K. Le Guin's Word for a World is Forest. They were translated in the same year, and both of them have interesting things that translators do with the gender and completely kind of sort of a little bit misrepresent from Russian to English especially. And that led me to kind of questions of, well, this Ursula K. Le Guin book was almost the only, in fact, I think the only feminist science fiction work that was translated into Russian during the Cold War and published, not in samizdat. And it kind of triggered all kinds of other questions that I've been asking myself and trying to answer. Why weren't feminist science fiction authors translated? Oh, no, almost no feminist thinkers were translated into Russian. What does it mean? What does it mean in terms of the different gender norms, the ideas of gender equality under communism, which just made everything look very different. Gender equality was not achieved, but propaganda-wise, yes, it was achieved. And it led me to all kinds of very interesting questions. So I've written 3 chapters of this book, drafted a bunch more stuff. So it's basically half written in the first draft, and I've written a book proposal. and then the war began. And I started asking myself questions like, who cares anymore? But I think people still care, actually. And if anything, it's more relevant, almost.
I was going to say it seems more relevant instead of less.
Yeah, I agree that it seems kind of timely, actually, to have a book like this come out.
So a lot of this is about censorship and about what was spoken and what was unspoken, and what was speakable and what was unspeakable. And then on the American side, on the English language side, because both British and American publishers were involved, it's about capitalism, and capitalism trying to make a product out of a philosophical work which is about society and not about capitalism. It's not set to appeal to a capitalist audience. It's not written under capitalism. And so how do you make a capitalist product out of it? With great difficulty. In fact, you don't manage to, but you try, is what happens. And so it's just a really cool project. I'm really excited about it, and it taps into my long-term interest in Ursula K. Le Guin and her work. And I found some really interesting material in her archives working on a completely different project, which is about Ursula's poetry, which I'm also working on.
How do you have time for all of this? That's a lot.
I don't sleep. I don't. No, it's only because I have such the power of hyperfocus that I manage to do those things, because I can do a lot very quickly if I'm hyperfocusing. Then I have burnout, and then I need to not do anything for a while. But I can do a lot very fast, and I like it. I mean, I just wish that I could do my natural cycle, which is I do everything, and then nothing. But life is not like this, sadly.
Alas.
If only life would behave and let us do what we want all the time.
It would be great, wouldn't it?
It would. It would also always be sunny when I want to read outside. that's part of this fantasy world.
There'll always be the snacks that somebody else brings you, your preferred snacks, and a cup of tea, and it's always sunny, and there's no war.
And the cats want to snuggle when you want to sit down.
Oh, that will never happen.
No, too far? Unrealistic?
No.
All right.
Everything else can happen, but cats, nothing can go.
This is why you need pugs, because they always want to snuggle.
True.
Yeah.
Thank you, both of you, so much for joining us at whatever time of day it happens to be for you right now. We really appreciate it and had such a great time talking to you.
Before you go, though, can you let our listeners know where you can be found on the internet, where they can buy your books?
Okay, yes. You can find me at adahoffman.com with that hyphen between Ada and Hoffman. You can find me on Twitter at X asymptote. I named myself after a math term because I was not really thinking of discoverability. And you can find my books, The Outside and The Fallen. If you go on my website, there will be purchase links for them at various online retailers, as well as purchase links for my story collection, Monsters in My Mind, and my dinosaur poetry collection, Million Year Elegies.
Okay, and you should read all of those, by the way, because they're awesome. And you can find me at rblemberg.net and on Patreon as rblemberg, and on Twitter, where I tweet a little bit too much sometimes, at @RB_Lemberg. And you can find my books at major retailers. You can buy them from Tachyon, my publisher. Birdverse books can be found on Tachyon website, and Everything Thaws you can find at Amazon, as well as my publisher for that book, which is Benio the Press. And the Raven Bookstore is doing special pre-order campaign for the Unbalancing, where I will physically go there. It's a store in Kansas. It's a very lovely store with lots of cats. Maybe not lots of cats, but definitely it has cats. I've not counted the cats. It might just be one cat.
More than zero.
More than 0 cats are involved in the store. And I will go there and I will sign the books and I will draw a bird on each and every book.
I'm tempted to buy another copy just so I can have that too.
You're going to fly to Kansas too?
I can draw a bird for you if we ever intersect. I'm going to be happy to draw you a bird.
I would love that.
Anyway, on that note.
Thank you both so much for joining us. This has just been a wonderful chat. We're sorry for keeping you up late.
Don't be sorry. This was awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Fiction Fans.
Come disagree with us. We are on Twitter and Instagram at FictionFansPod. You can also email us at fictionfanspod@gmail.com.
If you enjoyed the episode, please rate and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and follow us wherever your podcasts live.
Thanks again for listening, and may your villains always be defeated. Bye.
Bye.